Hi, everybody. My name is Kieran Moore. I'm a consultant paediatric psychiatrist in Crumlin in Dublin, and I think I'll use the words filling in for, or trying to fill the shoes of Professor Fiona McNicholas, who's on leave this week. And I thank her for allowing me this opportunity. And just to go through today, it's, as you know, the webinar series is organised by the Academic Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the College of Psychiatrists. And I'm also co-hosting with the support of Dr. Bláthnaid Gavin and Dr. Neurosurgery. I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, in the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland. And the format of the sessions is a 45-minute presentation by our guest speaker, followed by 15 minutes questions and answers. And you can use the chat facility at the bottom of your screen. Please send in questions during the talk, and I will then raise the questions with the speaker at the end of the talk. We are recording the event just so people are aware, and it will be available on our website. So today our topic is why everything you know about language is wrong. And our guest speaker is Elliot M Murphy, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Vivian L. Smith Department of Neurosurgery at the McGovern Medical School, University of Texas Health Science Center, Houston, and the Texas Institute for Restorative Neurotechnologies, which is quite a mouthful and pretty impressive. And I'll let Dr. Murphy go through his own bio, but I do notice that he has a thesis focusing on the works of James Joyce and Oscar Wilde. So I'm looking forward to hearing bits of that if that comes out as well. So over to you, Dr. Murphy, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the very kind invite. So yeah, I'm based in Texas. I'm at the Department of Neurosurgery at McGovern. I do intracranial language research on epilepsy patients. And I started out in linguistics, kind of exploring the computational and representational and psycholinguistic basis of language. And then I kind of progressed more into the kind of like neurobiological basis of it, the kind of real-time implementation of it. So given the the background of this audience, I thought it'd be a good idea for me to kind of start fairly general and just introduce some background assumptions that I'm going to be working with, and then maybe progress towards the end of the talk into some more kind of empirical questions. And present to you some particular findings from the lab that I'm working at the moment. So let's just start out very simply. I thought it would be a good idea for me just to interrogate a few basic core common claims that I assume most people more or less believe to be true. And then I'm going to try and interrogate them a little bit and try and show that the study of languages may be a little bit more complicated. So the first claim that I'm going to interrogate is the idea that the English language is a language. We have to start with a very simple definition of what is a word if we're going to move to concepts like language. So typical definition would be a word is some kind of sound with a meaning with it. But turns out that the concept of the word is really more of an informal abstraction from what's called folk psychology. So folk psychology is just a kind of study of how human beings intuitively grasp reality, physics, morality, motion, color, number, things like that. Which don't necessarily have any mapping onto actual scientific study. So in the same way that we intuitively think about motion involving contact, that may not necessarily be the way that the physical basis of the universe is actually organized. And the same is true for cognition. So linguistics actually deals with units of computation. So linguists don't actually really care about languages. So, just to take me as an example, my worst GCSE was French. I hated it. I couldn't learn languages at all. French, Spanish, German. Didn't want to learn them. Didn't really care about them too much. But linguistics is more a kind of a more abstract study. It's the study of the language faculty, the kind of component of the mind that allows human beings to acquire and possess any given language. So it's not so much about a focus on any given kind of surface phenomena. It's more about the system of mental operations that are brought about and entertained during the construction of any given linguistic process. So languages are basically assumed to be made of constellations of what are called syntactic, semantic, and phonological features. So features that have a kind of formal grammatical role, features that give a meaning, and features that give some kind of externalization component. whether that's in terms of articulatory acoustic motor commands, like organizing pronunciations, or if you have sign language, it would be organizing, motor gestures, things like that, right? So I'll give you some examples. If we assume that words are constellations of syntactic, semantic, and phonological features, you get a kind of grid-like structure where not every single word has to have any of these features, okay? So take words like ouch or hello. These words have an obvious semantics and a phonology, but they have no syntax, right? There's no kind of grammatical role to them. You can just declare them in kind of a single utterance. On the other hand, there's also words like in English, expletives like it, where these elements have a syntax and a phonology, but they have no conceptual semantics, right? In English, there's a particular grammatical rule that says that you have to fill the subject position. So you have to say it is completely dry. In Italian, you don't have to do that. In Italian, you can just say is completely dry. You don't need to say it. It's called what's called a project language. So it in English is a good example of a word that has a syntax and a phonology, but no semantics, right? So that's kind of ticks 2 boxes out of the 3 possible boxes. And then even more mysteriously, and this is a really kind of mysterious component of language, so I'm not going to talk about it too much because it requires a lot of background. But the basic idea is that there's also elements of computation in language that involve a syntax and a semantics, but no phonology. So you don't even say them. They're just kind of implicit. You interpret them and you compute them during structure generation, but you don't actually have to say them. So if you take a sentence like John read Infinite Jest, you can turn that into a interrogative and say, what did John read? In pronunciation, you just say, what did John read? But in interpretation, you have to associate what is called the filler gap in computer science, where you have the 2 elements, what, and the place where it's been reconstructed from. The elements have to be associated in some way. And so when you interpret it, you're really interpreting it as what did John read what? Because they're associated, they have a kind of necessary logical connection. Whereas in pronunciation, you just give the linear string, what did John read? And that's all you have to say. So the language system seems to manipulate these atoms of computation. And again, just to be very clear, these are basically elementary features, phonological, semantic, syntactic features that seem to be represented somehow in certain posterior temporal portions of the brain. And we call this a lexicon. And of course, there's no necessary connection between any of these features and any given word-like element. They can be a cluster of any number of them. But so if words cannot be defined mind externally in terms of acoustic properties or aspects of speech and sign, then how can we go about defining what language is, right? If you can't even define what a word is very clearly, then how can we define what language is? So there's a really clear and I think very useful distinction that I'm going to assume, which is the distinction between what's called I language and E language. So linguists basically only study I language. I language is the internal, individual, intentional with an S means is related to the study of meaning, so semantics. So that's the actual study of language, namely any individual human being has a mind internal grammar. Everyone has a different one. And this is in contrast to what's called the E language position, which assumes that languages are kind of out there. The English language is somehow kind of mind external property that human beings kind of come into approximation with during language development as infants. And it's this kind of invariant external property of the environment that we come to become familiar with. Whereas linguists assume that's not the case. There's only individual human beings and individual minds. And if you and me can communicate successfully, that's not because we share a language. It's because both of our I languages sufficiently overlap such that communication can be more or less achieved, right? So the common claim is that there's like 6,000 or 7,000 languages on the planet. I don't know, whatever the number is, but really there's 8 billion or however many human beings there are. In the same way, there's no English visual system, right? There's no French visual system. There's only the visual system, right? And that's the same with language, right? Language is ultimately a kind of mind internal computational system, which there's no actual way to define it scientifically and biologically outside of the I language sense, right? In fact, when you think about it, there's no real way to define there's no real clear way to define E language. Even if you tried, it's impossible to do. You could say it's like a collection of utterances or a collection of conventions or something, but that's not, that's just a kind of informal definition. It's not a real candidate for like scientific investigation, right? And in fact, even going beyond this, mental computation of language is considerably, abstracted away from physical reality. So it turns out when we read, we actually skip 30% of the words when we actually see on the page, especially function words. Eye tracking studies have shown that we just basically see what the language system needs to see in order for us to kind of pass the minimal threshold to infer a particular meaning. And the brain basically throws out most of the sensory data that it takes in with respect to language. It only gets like the pieces of information that are necessary, minimally necessary to construct a particular meaning. And again, pushing the puzzle even further, here's another example of where the E language definition kind of gets us into trouble here. If you ask about the history of English, you can ask yourself, well, has it always been the same language? What defines a language in this kind of E language sense? In Old English, the syntax of Old English permitted SVO structures, which is subject, verb, object. So John ran to the park. In Middle English, you had a switch to SOV, so subject, object, verb, and there was some uses of VSO as well. But then in Modern English, you switch back to SVO. So you have SVO, then SOV, and now back to SVO again. So the question is it the same language, right? If language is something like Middle English, then there must have been a point when Modern English came about, a specific point in time, more or less, give or take some vagueness. But if you pursue this as a serious definition of what language is, you're not going to get anywhere. It's hopeless. It's impossible to. Ultimately, it's just a choice of an arbitrary choice. So humans therefore seem to have a kind of mind internal generative computation system that maps complexes of these features that I mentioned onto a given workspace to merge with other features, and it can do so recursively, and it can call the set again. So the basic computational procedure in language is called merge, where you take two elements and then put them together. So something like the man would be constructed by simply grabbing man and then putting them together. That's it. The man slept would be achieved by doing the same thing, but just merging it with a separate element. And this basic computational procedure is more or less all you need to enumerate the full computational complexity of language. And in fact, it's been claimed that restricting this operation to a single element, namely the empty set, can yield something like the natural numbers. So this gets to the idea of like how language seems to interface with other systems of cognition, and to what extent other systems of cognition are kind of reliant on it or piggyback on it in some way. So if you merge the empty set with itself, and again and again and again, you basically yield a simple linear enumeration of the natural numbers, which I think is a nice kind of interpretation. So we each have a distinctly set I language, as I mentioned. My I language is different from yours. Even though we can communicate successfully, the way that my syntax is set, my semantics, and definitely my phonology. I'm from Liverpool, so I've got quite a different phonology from most of the people from Ireland. But that's the only way we can define language. Like I said, an individual component of the mind brain. And in fact, it turns out that linguists have shown that most of the variation in what you could informally call the world's languages is actually in morphophonology, not in syntax semantics. So the world's languages, French, German, Russian, and so on, they differ in the way that they use functional morphemes, like ing for running, and also the phonology of the sound system. But the world's languages don't really differ in terms of the syntax and semantics. They do in terms of the word order, subject, verb, object. But in terms of the actual computational system, they don't seem to differ substantially. So another example of this is when you consider the fact that while two structures might exhibit different linear orders, they may exhibit the same underlying hierarchical order. So in English and Basque, you have different surface orders of the same underlying linear hierarchical order. So the hierarchical order in this case is some kind of verb and direct object being merged and then being merged with the subject. But you can linearize it in different ways. You can put the surface order in different ways, but the meaning is the same, right? And so because the meaning is the same, that suggests that there's some kind of underlying common structure. This is crucially very different from the syntax of non-human primates. So Campbell's monkeys are capable of individual single calls with very basic meanings, and they might be capable of a kind of simple morphological merge. So they could say, you know, crack, where crack would refer to, you know, there's a bird, or there's another monkey or something right in front of me. But that kind of limited syntax is basically all they're capable of, unlike humans. But of course, humans don't just, you know, concatenate phrases. We also label them. We give them a certain identity. And it's interesting to note that the way that we do this kind of determines the meaning that language feeds to interpretation. So consider the fact that when we merge red and boat, we don't just merge them equally. Whenever we merge two words, one of them kind of wins and becomes the head of the phrase. So red boat is a boat that is red. It's not a red quality that hosts boat-like features. So in that case, the head of the phrase, the label would be the boat. So the language system would interpret it as a noun phrase, not an adjective phrase. And the same is true for things like John ran. If you say John ran, this is an event in which John was the agent. John ran does not mean that there is a special kind of John, right, that has some kind of running qualities or whatever, right? So this is a very kind of simple observation. You might think it's kind of trivial, not very interesting, but it turns out to be the core kind of computational component that's unique to language, that delivers the full range of structured expressions that we can produce, and it also separates it from kind of non-linguistic modes of cognition. So this merge process therefore generates hierarchical structures, not just linear strings, right? There's a hierarchical relation. Certain elements are more important than other ones. So you can show this quite easily. If you take something like the man is happy and you want to form a question, you say, is the man happy? So you might think, well, the rule is just take, you know, the closest is style word, auxiliary. But it turns out that's not the case. If you say the man who is tall is happy, you can't say, is the man who tall is happy? You have to say, is the man who is tall happy? And the reason why that is because syntax cares about structural proximity, not linear proximity. So the second occurrence of is actually closer in terms of structural distance. It has to skip over a fewer number of hierarchical nodes. So it's actually closer, and it's easier to move to the front of the sentence because who is tall is embedded inside the sentence. So that's kind of a nice example of the hierarchical organization of language. And you can show this as well through things like substitution. You know, you can substitute an entire phrase just by using a single element, which suggests that syntax is kind of this complex identity constructing mechanism. There's also some interesting constraints here, which I'll come back to later. So if you say John ate chicken and bread for lunch, you can say what did John eat for lunch, but you can't say what did John eat chicken and for lunch. The entire conjunct, chicken and bread, has to be questioned, not discrete parts. And what that means is that syntax kind of respects the hierarchical unit that's been constructed in this case, right? So the conjunct, chicken and bread, is given its own individual syntactic identity. It's categorized as an individual phrase. And so if you want to do anything with it, you have to do the same thing to the equal parts. You can't kind of, you know, divide it any way you like. Interestingly, this actually hinders communicative efficiency, right? It's bad for communication for the language system to be designed this way, but that's the way it is. So I'll come back to that later. Another example is here. You can say, Sam gave a guitar to me and loaned a trumpet to you. And again, if you separate two larger conjuncts into even larger phrases, the same rule applies. Okay, so you can say, what did Sam give to me and loan to you? But you can't say, what did Sam give to me and loan a trumpet to you? In other words, you can't just question one of the conjuncts. You have to question both of them. Other puzzles arise when we reach the level of phenomenal reference. So you can say, Mary said that he has a lot of talent and that Peter should go far, in which case Peter and he co-occur and relate to each other. But you can't say he has a lot of talent and Peter should go far. That sounds a bit strange if you want he to refer to Peter. You can technically say it, but it sounds a bit weird. And the reason why is because in 1 and 2, the phrases involving he has a lot of talent have a different syntactic identity. In 1, they are what's called the complementizer phrase because they're headed by that. Whereas in 2, they're a tense phrase. So it seems that the ways that these phrases are identified syntactically seems to have a say in the kind of syntactic relations that emerge from it. So that's a very kind of peculiar property of language. And co-reference is also maintained through things like movement. I'll skip that. So there's a kind of a broader conclusion that we can make from this, which is that this business of merging things together might be a more kind of general computational property of the human mind, which can interface with other systems. So for instance, I've already mentioned mathematics, right? The natural numbers. But it might also interface with music. There's kind of a limited hierarchical structure in musical cognition, and also with morality. So the system of morality is very closely connected to the notion of linguistic event structure and thematic relations involving ages and patients and things like that, right? So when this universal generative component of merging things interfaces with the number sense system, you get natural numbers. When it interfaces with the sound system, you get music. When it interfaces with theory of mind and moral judgments, you get some kind of system of morality, and so on and so on. And so, as we all know, only humans have language, and it's been hypothesized that a kind of unique level of tool complexity involving this merge business, where you take like a rock and a shaft and you generate a higher order categorized object like a sphere, with an added functional abstraction for its use, not just its form. I'll get back to that in a little bit. And of course, alongside this, only humans have what Noam Chomsky basically loosely calls a science-forming faculty, which is the ability to basically perform Pearson abduction or non-deductive complex inference, which is something like, let's say some weird event occurs. We posit that if we know that if A is true, then this weird event would simply follow naturally. So we posit A, right? It's a kind of way of intuitively explaining things. So only human language can uniquely distinguish things like unlockable from unlockable, namely able to be unlocked, and unlockable, like the two senses in which we can kind of merge the two phrases, the two morphemes together. So if you look at this kind of simple hierarchical collection of symbolic computation, human language seems to be only capable of these nested tree structures down here. All these other forms of symbolic computation are performed by non-human primates and non-human animals. Only humans seem to be able to not just put things together, but put things together and then give it a kind of category, and then use that category again and again and again in this recursive fashion. And there's a recent preprint that I've written with Emma Holmes and Carl Friston, which talks about the ways in which this computational system might actually be grounded in elements of lower level natural law, like laws of physics and efficient computation and things like that. That's a kind of an interesting question that I won't go into here, but yeah, if you're interested, you can read the preprint. Okay, so second claim that I want to interrogate is the idea that language is for communication. This is a very, very common claim indeed. Again, most of these ideas I'm going to very briefly review are from this paper that came out last year in Glossa that you can consult if you're interested. But the basic idea I want to just interrogate is that most of language use on a day-to-day basis is actually not for communication, right? We do occasionally communicate with other people when we have to. It's a bit of a nuisance, it's kind of a pain, but when we do have to do it, we do it. But usually it's not a case of using language for communication. Talking to yourself, using cognitive capacities which language might have provided some kind of subconscious computational contributions to, maintaining social bonds, small talk, thinking to yourself, most of language use, as in the way that it's actually recruited by the human mind, is in a mind internal capacity. It's not for social interactions. And there's also very close ties between this syntactic system that I mentioned and meaning. So if you have a structure that was completely conceptually empty, it would not be natural language. So if you say something like the police car sirened up to the accident site, the meaning of the sentence does not come from the sound of the siren, right? It's not the semantics of the word siren meaning sound. It's from the way that the word siren is used as a particular type of verb. So it's not the meaning of the word siren that delivers this argument structure, this event structure. It's actually the syntax that delivers it. So the syntax of the sentence directly derives a unique type of meaning that we can construct using natural language. And even more intriguingly, linguistic computation seems to be optimized for the generation of interpretation, basically, and not for the generation of maximally communicative messages. So in other words, whenever there's a conflict between principles of computational efficiency and communicative efficiency, the former usually wins. So here's a nice quick example for you. If you have a statement like, you persuaded Saul to sell his car, you can question two elements there, right? You can question the agent or the object. And both of the questions in 11 that you can form have the same meaning, right? The exact same meaning. All you're doing is questioning, you know, who's here, and you know, what's the object, basically. You're just saying, hey, give me the agent, give me the object. But for some reason, you can only say 11b. You can only say, who did you persuade to sell what? You can't say, what did you persuade who to sell? And there's no law of communication barring that, right? There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to say that. If language is such a good, you know, communication system, you should be able to compute that meaning, but you can't do it. And basically, the reason why is because it's more computationally efficient to search down the tree and extract the first possible candidate for question formation. And in this case, it's who, right? It's Saul, right? The guy who's closest to the top of the tree. Again, this is a good example of showing that not only is, again, language hierarchically organized, it's also constrained by efficient computation. The language has to be efficiently computable. It has no choice. Even if this bars communicative efficiency, even if it makes communication less efficient and less flexible, you have no choice. It's just the way that the language system is designed. And I think that's a very curious property, and it's one that I think is worth thinking about as well, and maybe interrogating. There's also a slightly common argument from people like Gregory Higgok, which goes basically like this: general intelligence scores are often not impacted in patients that lose core language functions, so therefore language can't be closely intertwined with cognition. But this kind of ignores the fact that when language did originally evolve, back in the day, you know, 250,000 years ago, it likely had some initial cognitive benefit, which boosted the capacity of a range of non-linguistic cognitive functions. So that now, in 2021, if human beings have their language faculty impaired, it may not necessarily directly cause a impact on non-linguistic intelligence functions. But that's not the claim. The claim is not that there's a causal connection between them. The claim is just that through the evolution of language, it's very likely that other non-linguistic cognitive capacities were bolstered. And there's plenty of evidence for that from anthropology. So the unique contribution of language is really not to communication, it's to cognition, right? That's the basic idea. And it's worth bearing in mind that, you know, a lot of these ideas kind of go beyond common sense, but we have to remember that geometry was originally the study of land measurement, right? But it developed a sufficiently rich body of knowledge to abstract away from its original object of inquiry, and also departed from common sense intuition. So if you study geometry these days, you don't talk about hills and mountains, you talk about abstract principles. So our common sense intuitions about what language is actually have no place in science, right? If it's our intuition that language is for communication, or that words refer to things in the world and so on, that's just intuition, okay? There's no reason why it should have any place in science. It's a very kind of a curious property of modern psycholinguistics. So there's a professor at MIT, Fedorenko, who recently conducted a mechanical Turk study asking ordinary people what they thought language's primary function was. And most people obviously said communication. And she used this as empirical evidence to attack the conception of language as an instrument of thought. But of course, this does not really count as scientific evidence. It counts as evidence in, you know, a sociological sense or in a folk science, psychology sense. But again, you know, a physicist wouldn't conduct a survey asking random people on the street what they thought about the nature of light or energy. It's just not, you know, it doesn't contribute to scientific knowledge. It's just asking random people what they think about things, right? So the third thing I want to move on to very quickly, before I get to the neuroscience stuff, is the claim that words refer to things in the world. I'm going to argue that this is not the case, and I think I can show it in a couple of clear examples, so I'll be fairly quick here. So I'm going to make a quick distinction between what's called internalism and externalism. So internalism is the view in philosophy of language that mental representations are used to just make inferences about the world, basically. They just have a kind of representational cognitive role. On the other hand, there's externalism, which claims that what's going on in any individual's mind is not entirely determined by what's going on inside their brain. In other words, meaning is not in the head, right? Meaning somehow comes from the outside. So it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of the words are highly polysemous. So words like book, newspaper, city, and lunch involve associating a whole range of different meanings. So a lunch can be an abstract event, but also a physical item of food. So you can say things like lunch was delicious, but took forever, in which case there can't possibly be anything in the physical world that is simultaneously an event and a piece of food, right? So a lunch there's nothing in the physical world that can be an event, but also a physical object. And the same with things like book. You can say the book was, terrific, and it was hardback, in which case, the book is either a physical object or an abstract narrative. It can't be both at the same time. And so therefore, words like book and lunch do not exhibit a one-to-one relationship with things in the external world, right? They're just mental representations. And in the same way that a lot of vision scientists like to use visual illusions to expose the quirks of the human visual system, linguists also use what are called Escher sentences to expose the kind of non-referential character of language. So most people pass the following sentence as kind of acceptable. More people have been to Russia than I have. Okay, it sounds like it has a meaning, it sounds okay, but when you think about it, it's completely meaningless, right? The sentence is completely meaningless because what you're doing is you're contrasting a comparative calculation, okay, more or less is a comparison, and you're comparing that with a binary choice, okay? So I've either been to Russia or I haven't. It's yes or no, okay? So yes or no versus more or less. It's a semantic paradox, but it sounds great because the human language system has all sorts of ways of disguising and parsing things quickly. The goal is just to rapidly get the meaning, even if that means that some fundamental semantic violations have to occur. But again, this just reinforces the idea that the use of language is not to really refer to the external world. It's just to kind of serve in cognitive inference generation. And this is also true for simple lexical items. Excuse me. So a noun like school actually has properties that go beyond the semantic complexity of a range of other representations. So you can say things like the large school with large windows next to the river starts at 9 a.m. and has a strict headmaster and unruly students. But again, there can't be anything in the extramental world that can simultaneously be a location, an artifact, an event, a social group, right? There's just nothing. You can't do that. So the word school does not have a one-to-one relationship with something in the physical world. Okay, it's a very complex mental representation. It's a concept that we can use in a bunch of different contexts, but it doesn't inherently have a particular semantic role. This is also true for sentences like the average man is concerned about wage cuts because he needs to afford insurance, right? Language surely doesn't commit us to the belief that the world is made of things like the average men and wage cuts, right? These are just concepts. They're not like actual statements about the world. And at the same time, London can be fun, it can be polluted, and you can also imagine a situation in which London is actually burnt down entirely and rebuilt, 10, 20, 30 miles up the River Thames. And you can still call it London, right? If you wanted to, you could rebuild the city, even though it's physically a completely different entity. You can still call it London. It can have a continuous sense of identity, even though the object itself, the physical sense, has been destroyed. Let's skip this. But it's worth pointing out very quickly that H2O has a completely different meaning from water. So even physical concepts like H2O turn out to be very different from natural language concepts. So Diet Coke, for instance, has a higher percentage of H2O than water, most common use of water. And so, water is more, again, water is a word, right? It's a lexical item. It doesn't have an actual one-to-one relationship with the external world. So water and H2O are completely different things. One is a concept that is used for a certain functional use in communication and cognition. And the other one is a physical postulate in physical theory, okay? And postulates in physical theory are scientific constructs. They have nothing to do with ordinary natural language expressions. But it's very easy to kind of get trapped in this illusion that words do have, in fact, a referential role. Even most scientists actually believe that words like water are basically referential to external properties of the environment, but they're not. The natural language has no relationship to the external world. it's a completely insular, isolated component of the mind brain, and it's just used for successful inference generation. That's basically all there is to it. And even going beyond this, you can think about more complex entities. So scattered entities can actually be taken to be a single physical object under particular contexts. So think of things like a Calder mobile. This is a thing, whereas a collection of leaves on a tree is not a thing, right? Unless the leaves that are placed intentionally, like for art installation, in which case you could call it a thing, right? So what is defined as a thing is often, in fact, always a human-specific notion. It has to do with function, origin, intentional use and things like that. It has very little to do with actual physical constitution, okay? Actual physical constitution it plays a role, it obviously plays some role, but it turns out not to play a major role. And there's a bunch of other paradoxes here. I've already mentioned the London one, but the famous one from Socrates is you have a pile of sand and you keep taking grains off it, at which point is it no longer a pile, right? There's an inherent vagueness in a lot of these concepts, which again reinforces the idea that this inherent vagueness just violates any possibility of successful direct reference to the external world. I'll just skip this. But yes, a final point here is that psycholinguistic lens might also be needed. So it turns out that the order in which you refer to particular polysemous senses is impacted by things like semantic complexity. So for some reason you can say the city has 500,000 inhabitants and outlawed smoking in bars last year. But if you flip the order, it sounds a bit strange. The city outlawed smoking in bars last year and has 500,000 inhabitants. Okay, that sounds a little bit less semantically okay. And that was actually the topic of my PhD thesis. So if you're interested in that, you can download that and have a. If you're finding it difficult to get to sleep at night, you can print this out and have a good read. So the final claim I want to briefly review is the idea that the brain's language areas give rise to language. I'm going to just rebut this just in a single slide, and then we can move on because there's not much time left. But if you want to read about it, you can read this preprint. The basic claim is that I've made with my co-authors is that it turns out that the language network actually extends far beyond traditional kind of perisyllabian, frontotemporal regions to substantial parts of superior, middle temporal inferior parietal cortex, as we all know. But it extends beyond this to subcortical structures. So things like basal ganglia involved in action perception, hippocampus involved in semantic memory, and thalamus involved, it turns out, in lexicality. Lexical decisions are actually made in the thalamus too. So what was traditionally called the reptilian brain, subcortical structures, actually turn out to have a pretty substantial role in higher cognition. A lot of this is covered in a recent book that just came out from Cambridge University Press, in which I kind of propose this model that I'll just briefly review before moving on to autism. So the idea here is that the human brain is a system of, it's a dynamical system. When neurons fire in the brain, they don't just do it randomly. They fire at particular frequencies, and different portions of cortex typically fire at different frequency bands, depending on the task. And the model that I pursue here calls upon different types of cross-frequency coupling, where if you're familiar with the neuroscience literature, you might be familiar with this. The basic idea is that forms of low frequency phase and high frequency amplitude correlations are involved in information transfer in the brain. And you can kind of prove this using some kind of tricky experimental paradigms. So one of them involves what's called theta gamma coupling, where you have the phase of low frequency theta power in the brain coupling to high frequency gamma. And it turns out if you use TACS, you can intentionally modulate the ratio of theta gamma relations, such that you can basically slow down theta power, allowing you to just kind of squeeze in an extra gamma cycle. And it turns out that this corresponds to working memory performance. So the idea is that items in working memory are basically like represented by individual gamma cycles. So in this case, a patient in A would be able to remember 6 items, whereas the person in B who's had their theta slowed down would be able to remember 7 items. So each item in working memory kind of corresponds to this these cycles. And I apologize that this is very abstract. We can go into it in more detail if you like, but again, the references are on the screen. But yeah, the basic idea is that slower theta waves improve the fidelity of representations accessed, right? So there's a kind of cost-benefit ratio of slowing down theta and squeezing in more items, or remembering fewer items with greater fidelity. And that's the kind of idea that the brain is a dynamical system. If it wants to only remember one or two things in exquisite detail, the size of theta doesn't matter. If it wants to remember lots of things in low detail, then the lower frequencies would be modulated by that process. So that's a kind of active process of how the brain would intentionally kind of craft its frequency dynamics in order to respond to particular behavioral needs and computational demands. And it turns out that these aspects of brain dynamics might be able to explain certain language deficits in individuals with schizophrenia and autism. So in a couple of recent papers, I've tried to kind of ground a lot of the neuroimaging literature on autism and language deficits in autism. So individuals with autism typically have problems with syntax. So problems with like complex phrases, like WH questions, like the things I mentioned, relative clauses involving embedding, long distance binding relations between elements in the sentence. And we've kind of drawn up this kind of model here, which associates particular frequency bands with respect to neural oscillations and particular behavioral correlates. So things like theta does not synergistically engage with gamma during speech. Again, that links into the idea that theta gamma coupling that I just mentioned has a kind of a causal role in higher order language. And there's also other examples too. Some of them are quite exotic, some of them are quite interesting. But the basic idea is that language deficits can be grounded through directly these aspects of brain dynamics. Again, another recent paper kind of reviews that in more detail. So the basic claim is that language deficits in schizophrenia and autism can be explained by assuming that the abnormal cross-frequency coupling profiles impair the domain general ability to extract particular items from working memory. And there's a recent lit review that hypothesizes that especially low delta theta frequency phase amplitude coupling should be affected in ASD in conjunction with reduced local phase amplitude coupling and of things like intertrial phase coherence and other complex neurobiological processes. So these ideas are basically in line with the view that certain psychiatric illnesses could be viewed as oscillatory connectomopathies, right? Where there's a kind of dysfunction, neural dysrhythmia. So rhythms in the brain are kind of firing as they should be. And one final thing that I think we might have a little bit of time to get into is how this relates to things like direct intracranial recordings. So there's a recent bioarchive preprint that I just put up with co-authors, my PI Nitin Tandon and collaborators Peter Hagor and Katrin Segayat, exploring the one topic that I mentioned earlier. So I mentioned the issue of red boats. So, a red boat is a boat that's red. It's not a red thing that has boat-like qualities. So what we did is we did an experiment probing minimal phrasal processing in 19 epilepsy patients. So these are patients with intractable epilepsy. They're in the AMU, they're in the hospital for epilepsy monitoring, for seizure monitoring, basically. And we acquire data from them voluntarily whilst they're spending a few days, sometimes a few weeks in the AMU. And they undertake these kind of, language tasks that help us kind of map higher order language functions. So they have electrodes implanted in their brains, usually a couple of hundred per patient. And these are either placed on the surface of cortex and under the dura, or they're actually drilled directly into the brain itself. So passing through the sulci, going into white matter. And what we basically found is we presented auditory pairs of real phrases and fake phrases. So either a real phrase like red car, or a phrase involving a fake word like folg or nulg or blog, right? So kind of pseudo word. And this image here represents the coverage that we have over patients. So most patients had coverage over temporal regions, which is not surprising because that's where epilepsy tends to be housed, and also fairly decent coverage around frontal cortex. We found responses to pseudo words over real words in posterior temporal regions. So this is a surface-based analysis which depicts which high-frequency gamma activity correlates to particular portions of cortex. So as you can see, posterior temporal regions seem to engage more for processing pseudo words after the presentation of the onset of the word. And here is a couple of exemplar electrodes from different patients where you can see the kind of subdural grid electrodes here, or the SEEG electrodes directly probing into grey matter itself. And we also found that there was a low frequency power increase slightly before the onset of the noun during anticipatory trials. In other words, after the patient has just heard a real adjective and when they're anticipating a real phrase, so just after they've heard red, we see a kind of anticipatory preemptory response in IFG and ATL, exclusively in low power, but not in high frequency activity, which is kind of interesting, right? So this low frequency power, which has been known to synchronize distant cortical regions, is triggered just before the onset of the second word. So just before and around the point at which the second word is presented, kind of ramping up and generating some form of syntactic prediction, right? So kind of readying the slot to be filled. So you have red, you know you're going to fill, you know you're going to construct a noun phrase. It's just a case of which noun, right? So this is the kind of more abstract syntactic structure, anticipation, before the actual word is presented, right? So it could be a red boat, it could be a red horse, etc., etc. And then we also found that when it comes to the actual point of second word presentation, so when you actually hear a real phrase like red boat, at the point of boat, we find exclusive engagement of a really narrow strip of portion of tissue in PSTS, so posterior superior temporal sulcus. We found a bunch of electrodes that obviously cared about meaning. There were some electrodes that cared about whether or not a word was a real word or a fake word, and these were in green. But we also found electrodes that only responded to phrasal meaning, okay, which is kind of curious. So we see a lot of electrodes in green that care about lexical meaning, but then there are other electrodes that only care about phrasal meaning, okay? So this electrode here in orange, for instance, doesn't care about words versus pseudo words, okay? There's no response there, but it does care about phrasal meaning. And what was interesting is that these are usually linearly approximate, like spatially very close to each other. So we describe it as a kind of cortical mosaic. There's a kind of mosaic structure in PSTS where portions of this narrow strip of PSTS either code for lexical meaning, and then the lexical meaning is entered into a higher order assembly in neighboring tissue, right next door, like 10 millimeters away. And this portion of tissue exclusively codes for higher order phrasal meaning, right? So it's a kind of assembly process. You get your words, you merge them, and then you construct a higher order identity. And as you can see from the plot and C, they are fairly spatially approximate. So there's a much broader swath of PSTS and PSTG responsible for lexicality, but there's a much narrower portion that only codes for phrase composition, okay? So here's just one quick spectrogram just showing the difference in PSTS. You have a much more intense BGA response, so around, again, high gamma, 70 to 150, than you do for non-compositional phrases. So non-compositional just means a fake phrase, right? And then finally, we also looked at the functional connectivity. So the regions that I just showed you, PSTS, that responded more for phrases, also showed greater connectivity with frontal and anterior temporal regions. So it's like you construct the phrase meaning and then you transmit it to extra linguistic systems for interpretation. Okay, so you construct the phrase red boat and then you ship it off to IFG for a kind of more memory-related processes, memory and interpretation processes. And then finally, one final figure here, just to quickly show you that after the phrase was presented, the patients were also shown a picture, and they had to basically say yes or no if the picture matched the phrase, right? So if they hear red boat and they see a picture of a blue boat, they say no. And interestingly, anterior insula, which is the very tucked away portion of the brain that can only really be detected either through fMRI or ECOG, the kind of stuff that we're doing, anterior insula seem to care very much about the matching of a particular phrasal meaning with some kind of visual, non-linguistic stimulus. So it's almost as if the kind of dorsal IFG and anterior insula are kind of using phrasal meaning for a particular purpose, right? They're not responsible for constructing phrasal meaning, but they are responsible for using phrasal meaning, right? They have a kind of goal-directed use for it. So that's basically a quick overview of the intracranial research. It kind of maps onto a lot of the concerns that I mentioned. But I think, hopefully what I said about the progression from basic kind of almost philosophical statements about language can be shown to pretty directly map onto kind of, cutting edge, sophisticated neuroscientific research, and have a kind of more direct impact on directing that kind of research moving forward. So the main message is that if you're going to explore the excuse me, if you're going to explore the neurobiological basis of language, it's very important to actually have a really robust understanding of what language is, right? Have a very clear understanding of what the system is that you're exploring. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Dr. Murphy, just to say thank you, that was really quite amazing. I'm going to have to go back and look at it again. The detail is fantastic, and it really just certainly makes me reflect on language, which we take as for granted the whole time. And as you say, we certainly, most of us think of it as a tool of communication. So that was really fantastic. I'd love to have you back to go into the neuroscience in more detail.
Yeah.
And I'd like to thank you so much for that, and to the audience for your time and commitment to the service. And we will, just to remind people, we'll send a brief feedback form, which we hope you will complete and alert us to new topics of interest. And just to remind people, the next speaker next week is, and the topic is the little things that matter most in psychiatry. And the person that will be presenting is Dr. Gerard Shark, who's a lecturer in the Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Science, and he's a principal investigator in UCC. So look, I'm aware of time. I'll just feedback, lots of positive feedback. Just very helpful update and complex subject. Fascinating, thank you. Fascinating stuff, Elliot. And Dr. Barry O'Donnell just has a question. Very much welcome Elliot's presentation on language. Would be interested in hearing if he has looked at how French psychiatrists, following the work of Jacques Lacan, put language at the heart of their clinical practice and fundamental to training in psychoanalytically informed psychiatric practices.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but a lot of Lacan's early work, like his earlier publications, are really much more in tune with what I was saying about the kind of importance of subconscious, pre-conscious linguistic capacities as a kind of an aspect of cognitive life that cannot be probed just through direct introspection, right? In other words, the idea is that there's something else going on. It's not just something that you can directly introspect on. I think that was a very important contribution. Yeah, I think some of the things I mentioned about ASD and schizophrenia, there's no real consensus on the extent to which a lot of these disorders and conditions are linguistic in nature. I know more recent publications are kind of shying away from the idea that ASD has a largely linguistic component, but I think that's still up for discussion. I think it's important to recognise that. So there's certain theories with respect to schizophrenia relating pronoun use to self-identity. So there's the idea that mixing up. There are certain patients that kind of mix up their pronouns. They confuse I for you and you for we and me for you and so on. There's a kind of transitional process for which pronouns get messed up internally. And that's one possible explanation. It's not a full explanation, but it's one particular theory for how sense of self and reference to others and sense of others can get kind of skewed in schizophrenia, in the sense that it is primarily a linguistic notion, right? In fact, the sense of self is a linguistic notion, right? Self, me, these are kind of purely linguistic concepts. So. I'm not, most of my recent research has not been in ASD and schizophrenia, and I'm not a psychiatrist at all. But my impression, being a linguist, is I'm obviously biased to kind of stress the importance of language in pretty much, all aspects of cognition. Yeah.
Thank you, Elliot. Kieran, can I just come in, because I would, Kieran, as you're saying, maybe not enough attention paid to language, and that's why I mentioned the work of Jacques Lacan, because he put that as central to, a psychoanalytically informed practice of psychiatry. I'm not a psychiatrist either. I'm in the psychoanalytic field, but continually try to offer opportunities for people in psychiatry to hear about, looking at some of the points that you were making. I mean, you know, if you look at, you were challenging the notion of language as communication. So when somebody comes in, a patient comes in and you ask them, how are you? And tell me about yourself. You are presuming they're going to give you information. Of course, if we look at language more closely, we realize that language isn't primarily to do with the transfer of information. It's much more likely it's to do with seducing, with deceiving, with engaging you, whatever I have to say, whatever relation that might have. As you say, you very clearly challenge the whole idea of a one-to-one correspondence between what I say and what's out there in the world. So there's a lot of things there that I think you were very much bringing to the fore. And I suppose the question, I think, maybe for a lot of people in the audience, you know, that you know, maybe there needs to be more attention paid to how language functions, as you put it. You know, I would be more following Lacan and his following of Saussure and Jacobson and Benveniste, and these you know, variations on what you're drawing from as well. He has a very interesting exchange with Noam Chomsky in the mid-60s, where he uses Chomsky's example of colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which for Chomsky is nonsense, but syntactically intact. And Lacan says it's not nonsense. I can make some sense of colorless green. It's contradictory. But you know what? I'll finish on this. The reference was made to the fact that you have read and studied the work of James Joyce, Oscar Wilde too. But let's say James Joyce, who Jacques Lacan paid a lot of attention to. I mean, he would see Finnegan's Wake as an exploration in language, a linguistic project. He would suggest that Joyce's relation to language was that of a psychotic. Now, Joyce, thankfully for Joyce, didn't suffer from psychosis. His daughter, unfortunately, did. But it's pushing it to the very limits and beyond. And when you say about, you know, the notion of I, me, you, these in linguistic terms, these shifters, that it depends on who's uttering them as to who's owning them at any one time. And then you have you use the word possess. And the whole idea of
possess. I'm going to have to stop you there. That's really fantastic.
Leave it
do you want to respond to anything there? Or?
No, I mean, I completely agree with everything Barry said. There's a lot of very interesting ideas. I'll just say one quick thing. I remember Richard Dawkins in the early 70s had a paper on his idea is that the evolution of language contributed more to the capacity to lie and deceive, basically. And that was, I think that's a totally true idea. But yeah, a lot of cool ideas that I will definitely think about. Thank you very much.
Thanks. It's 12:30, so I'm going to wrap up. Just one last thing from my own point of view. I was struck how many times you said the language doesn't sound right, and that's probably not in itself a very scientific phrase, sound, but it's actually the most important thing isn't it, in terms of how people feel. So there's a whole feeling bit to it as well. But listen, thank you, that was fascinating. And I understand you're from Liverpool originally as well, and you have an Irish father, so you're very much at home here. And thank you again, and thanks to everybody else. And I think Prof McNicholas is back next week, and thanks to all the UCD crowd as well. Take care, guys. Bye.